The oldest stories about the Shadow Mage always began the same way, with a candle that would not stay lit. Every village elder in the Eldenmore foothills knew a version. In some tellings, the candle was in a temple. In others, a cottage. In the versions Sarah Dunwald had grown up hearing, delivered by her grandmother on winter evenings in a voice that made ordinary things feel like the edges of something enormous, the candle was in a library, a great library, in a city that no longer existed, on a night when something had gone very wrong with the world. The candle refused to burn not because there was no flame, but because the shadows in the room were eating the light faster than it could be made. Sarah was 26 years old, a licensed archivist for the Thornwall Historical Society, and she had spent the last 4 years being professionally skeptical of exactly this kind of story. She was finding it more difficult than usual, standing in the ruin of Calden's Keep at 2 hours past sunset, holding a lantern that had just gone out. The lantern was good quality. She had bought it herself, oil-fed, with a double wick and a glass housing designed to resist wind. There was no wind in the keep's inner hall. There was, in fact, very little of anything in the inner hall. Stone walls stripped bare by 3 centuries of weather and scavengers. A flagstone floor cracked by frost and root, and a darkness that Sarah had been telling herself for the last several minutes was perfectly ordinary darkness, and not the specific quality of darkness that her grandmother's stories had described as shadows eating the light. She struck her flint. The spark caught. The wick took flame. The light lasted approximately 4 seconds. Right, she said aloud. This was a habit she had developed during her first solo field research trip, when the silence of empty ruins had begun to feel less like absence and more like presence, and she had found that speaking dispelled it, usually. Right, that is a thing that is happening. She took her secondary lamp from her pack, the small, ugly clay one she carried for exactly this class of situation, because clay lamps were harder to extinguish, and easier to hold on to under duress, filled it from her oil flask, and lit it from her flint. It burned with the stubborn, graceless persistence of something that had never been elegant, but had strong opinions about continuing to exist. It did not go out. Sarah had come to Calden's Keep because of a discrepancy. 4 months ago, cataloging a donation to the Society's collection from the estate of a recently deceased antiquary named Gorvin Pesh, she had found a journal. Gorvin Pesh had been a moderately respected collector of historical artifacts with a particular interest in the pre-Sundering period, the 3 centuries, before the great collapse of the Old Compact, when the dozen city-states of the Eldenmore had operated under a shared system of magical governance that had worked, in the broad strokes, until it very thoroughly didn't. Pesh had died without heirs, his collection had gone to the Society, and the journal had been at the bottom of a crate marked Miscellaneous Personal Effects. Low priority, it was not low priority. Sarah had read it in one sitting, which had caused her to miss dinner and arrive home at midnight and lie awake for 2 hours afterward thinking. The journal was not Pesh's own writing. It was older, much older, the paper and ink placing it somewhere in the early post-Sundering period, approximately 280 years ago, and it appeared to be a record of field observations made by someone who had been, in the parlance of the time, a shadow scholar, a practitioner whose work focused specifically on the magical properties of darkness, shadow, and the spaces between light sources. The author had never given a name. They referred to themselves throughout only as the Keeper, in the third person, with a consistency that suggested this was not modesty but practice, the habit of someone accustomed to not being known. The journal described, in technical language precise enough to make Sarah's teeth ache with the effort of parsing it, a project of enormous scope, an attempt to use the magical properties of shadow as a preservative medium. Not preservation of objects, preservation of information. The Keeper had theorized, and had apparently spent years testing, that shadows cast by objects of significant historical or magical resonance retained a kind of memory, an imprint of the events they had witnessed, that could under certain conditions be read. Not perfectly, not completely. More like hearing a conversation through a wall. You caught the shape of things, the weight of moments, the emotional register of what had happened without the precise detail. The Keeper called this practice shadow reading, and the Keeper had been doing it in Calden's Keep, which had been the administrative heart of the Old Compact's magical governance, and which was therefore, if the theory held, saturated with the shadow memory of 3 centuries of history. The discrepancy that had sent Sarah here tonight was this. The Thornwall Historical Society's official record of the Old Compact held that the sundering, the collapse of the shared magical system that had ended the pre-sundering period, had been an accident. A cascading failure of the resonance lattice that connected the city-state's magical infrastructure, triggered by an overload event in Calden itself. This was the consensus position. It was in every reputable text. Sarah had written a monograph supporting it 3 years ago. The Keeper's Journal said something different. It said, in careful and specific language, that the shadow memory of Calden's Keep did not record an accident. It recorded a decision. Sarah stood in the dark of the Keep's inner hall with her clay lamp burning its stubborn flame and felt the quality of the silence around her change. Not threatening, not hostile. The way a room changes when someone who has been sitting very quietly in it decides to stop pretending they're alone. "I know you're here," she said. I read the journal. The shadows in the far corner of the hall shifted, gathered, and resolved themselves into the suggestion of a figure, tall, robed, the edges of its form uncertain in the way of things that were partly made of something other than light's absence. It had been waiting, Sarah understood, for exactly this. The figure did not speak, at first. It moved. If movement was the correct word for something whose locomotion was less walking and more a slow redistribution of where it chose to be dense, to the center of the hall, and there it settled. And in the steadier light of Sarah's clay lamp it became more defined. Not less strange, but more present. A person-shaped concentration of shadow that had the quality of someone who had been many things over a very long time and had arrived at a particular stillness. Sarah did not run. She had excellent reasons for this beyond simple stubbornness. The primary one being that she was an archivist in the presence of a primary source, and the professional imperative to gather information was, in her experience, stronger than most of her other survival instincts. She held her lamp and waited. "You read the journal," the figure said. Its voice had the quality of sound in a large stone room, present in too many places at once, direction uncertain. "All of it, 3 times, Sarah said. "The technical sections more." A pause. "Most people who find their way here have read accounts of the Shadow Mage, the legend. They come looking for the story they already know. I came looking for the discrepancy," she said. Something in the quality of the figure's stillness shifted, a change too subtle for her to name, but present. She had spent 4 years learning to read the silences in documents, the places where information was absent or altered or had been deliberately shaped. She applied this skill now. The shift felt like recognition and something older. Something that might, in a person who had not been waiting in a ruin for a very long time, have been called relief. "Tell me what you know," Sarah said. "That isn't in the legend." This was, in retrospect, the question that opened everything. The Keeper's name had been Aldrich Nail. This was not in any legend. In any version Sarah had encountered, the Shadow Mage in the stories was always nameless, always singular, the title doing the work that biography usually did. But the figure in the hall of Calden's Keep confirmed it with the particular quiet of someone returning a thing to its rightful place. Aldrich Nail. Born in the city of Crestwall 293 years ago, son of a cartographer and an herbalist, educated in the old compact system of distributed magical academies, specializing, against the strong preferences of his instructors, in shadow scholarship, which was considered a minor and somewhat embarrassing branch of arcane study, useful for theatrical purposes and not much else. He had not agreed with this assessment. He had spent 15 years building the theoretical foundation of shadow reading before the sundering. He had been in his 40th year, not old but no longer young, with the specific patience of someone who had been told for a long time that his work didn't matter and had stopped requiring external validation of this fact when the compact began to come apart. "The official history says cascade failure," Sarah said. "Resonance overload, triggered by the Calden event." "The Calden event," Aldrich Nail said, "was the last in a sequence. Not a cause. An endpoint. Who decided?" The pause this time was longer. Not evasion, the weight of something that had been carried for a very long time and was being set down carefully. "The Compact's Governance Council," he said at last. 7 practitioners, senior tier, who had determined that the shared resonance lattice had been compromised. Not by accident. By design. Someone had been introducing small structural failures into the lattice over the course of approximately 12 years, individually minor, collectively catastrophic in the way of things designed to look like wear and tear rather than sabotage. Sarah felt the hair rise on her arms. Someone wanted the compact to collapse. Someone wanted to prevent a particular vote, Aldrich said. The council was 6 weeks from ratifying the Continuance Charter, a proposal that would have made the compact's magical governance permanent and binding. Certain city-states would have lost significant local autonomy. Certain practitioners with significant local power would have found that power substantially diminished. A pause. The sundering was not an accident. It was a political act, executed with extraordinary technical precision, by people who understood the resonance lattice well enough to destroy it from the inside. And the council knew this. The council decided, he said carefully, that the truth would cause more damage than the history they constructed. 7 city-states collapsing in the chaos of a revealed conspiracy versus 7 city-states collapsing in the tragedy of a terrible accident. They chose the version people could rebuild from. They chose the version that protected the people responsible. Yes, he said. They chose that too. Sarah was quiet for a moment, organizing what she was hearing against what she knew, looking for the places where they aligned and the places where they strained. The archivist's work. And you disagreed. I was not on the council, Aldrich said. I was a shadow scholar with an inconvenient habit of documentation. When I told the council what the shadow memory of this hall had shown me, what had actually happened in the final governance session, recorded in the shadows of these walls as clearly as anything I had ever read, they told me that I was incorrect, that I had misread the shadows, that shadow scholarship was a minor and somewhat embarrassing branch of arcane study, useful for theatrical purposes. There was no bitterness in the voice. That was what struck Sarah most. The flatness of a fact long since made peace with. What did you do? I documented everything I could, he said. The shadow readings from this hall. The structural evidence I could reconstruct from the lattice's failure pattern. The names, a pause. And then I made myself very difficult to find. He had spent the 2 centuries since in the same work he had always done, reading shadows. The ruins of the old compacts buildings, and there were many, scattered across the Aldenmoor foothills, returning slowly to the land, held the memory of 3 centuries of governance, politics, moments of decision and crisis, and ordinary administration. He had been methodical, he had been patient. He had built, in those 2 centuries, a documentation of the pre-sundering period that no historian had ever had access to, because no historian had known to look. And because the figure that legend had made of him, the Shadow Mage, mysterious and vaguely menacing, a cautionary figure in stories told to children, was an excellent reason not to go looking. The legend was useful, Sarah said slowly, working it out. The legend kept people away, Aldrich said, which kept the documentation intact, which kept the truth intact, until someone came looking for the discrepancy. Until someone came looking for the discrepancy, he agreed. Sarah held her lamp and thought about the journal in the Thornwall Society's collection, annotated in the careful hand of a dead antiquary who had apparently found his way here and decided that the safest thing he could do was bury the journal at the bottom of a crate marked low priority and hope that someone smart enough would eventually find it. The specific, imperfect trust of a person passing something forward. Show me, she said. Show me what the shadows remember. Shadow reading, Aldrich explained, was not a spell in any sense that the standard arcane frameworks used. It was closer to listening, a sustained attunement of perception that allowed a practitioner to receive the impressions stored in shadows, the way iron could be magnetized and thereafter orient itself toward north. You did not extract information from a shadow so much as put yourself in a condition of receptivity to it and then waited for the shadow to offer what it held. It could not be rushed. It could not be compelled. And it required in the reader a quality Aldrich described in a way that took Sarah a moment to translate. The willingness to receive something incomplete and resist the urge to complete it from your own assumptions. Most practitioners fail at that part, he said. Is that a warning? Sarah asked. It is a description of the process. She sat on the flagstone floor in the center of the inner hall. It was cold, and she was going to regret this in the morning. And she was already past caring. And Aldrich Nail, who had been doing this for 260 years, guided her through it. Not with the patient condescension of a teacher instructing a student in something simple, but with the precise, collegial clarity of an expert explaining a methodology to someone they expected to understand it quickly. She did understand it quickly. That was the thing about a lifetime of reading documents for what they didn't say. It was close enough to this. In the essential skill required that the gap was smaller than she'd expected. The hall's shadows moved. Not dramatically. Not with the theatrical darkness rippling that she associated with stage magic and overwrought illustrated chapbooks about the Shadow Mage. They moved the way memory moved, hesitantly at first, then with the committed motion of something that had been waiting to be received. And she received them. What she saw, felt, understood, it was not quite any of these things, was the final governance session of the old compact, held in this hall 283 years ago. The 7 council members. The debate over the continuance charter. The vote that everyone in the pre-sundering histories described as never completed, interrupted by the called-in event, the cascade failure, the accident. The shadows showed her the vote completed. It had passed. 6-1. And then she saw what came after. 3 of the council members stepping away from the table, into a side passage, and speaking very quietly among themselves with the specific economy of people executing a plan they had agreed on in advance. She came back to herself slowly, the way you surface from deep water, through layers of different kinds of cold, through the return of the stone floor's hardness against her legs, and the lamp's small warmth and the smell of old stone, and Aldrich Neal's patient waiting. The vote passed, she said. Yes, the continuance charter passed. And then 3 of the 6 who voted yes decided, he said, that the consequences of the charter passing were more threatening to their interests than the consequences of the compact failing. Yes, they destroyed the lattice themselves. After the vote, they introduced the final failures. The lattice had been weakened sufficiently over the previous 12 years that the final push required very little. A half-hour's work in the right places, by people who knew the system well enough. His voice was level. The sundering happened because the people who had agreed to be bound by the compact decided at the last moment that they preferred the world without it. Sarah sat with this. The falsified history she had written a monograph defending. The consensus position. The accident. The official version that had shaped 200 years of how the Alden Moor's people understood their own past. What had been lost, who was responsible for the loss. The names, she said. You said you documented the names. Yes. The families who descended from those 3 council members, they still exist. Some of them are still in positions of significant regional influence. Yes. And you've been sitting on this documentation for 200 years. The quality of Aldrich's stillness was different now. Not the patience of waiting, but something more complex. I have been determining, he said carefully, what the release of this documentation would actually accomplish versus what it would appear to accomplish. History is not neutral. The way information enters the world determines what the world does with it. I have read enough shadows to know that truth delivered at the wrong moment, without preparation, without the infrastructure to receive it, can be used in ways that harm the very people it was meant to serve. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. This was the ambiguity that the legend had never captured, she thought. The legend made the Shadow Mage frightening because he was powerful and unknown. The reality was more uncomfortable than that. A practitioner of extraordinary ability and patience who had been doing the slow, unglamorous, essential work of careful documentation for 2 centuries and who had not released what he knew because he understood, with the specific wisdom of someone who had watched history being made and unmade, that the release of truth was itself a consequential act requiring as much care as its collection. You need an archivist, she said. He was quiet, not a champion. Not someone to carry the story out into the world with a trumpet. An archivist. Someone who understands how to structure information for release. What context is necessary? What sequence? How to prevent a 200-year-old scandal from being weaponized by the people best positioned to benefit from it rather than the people who deserve the truth. Yes, Aldrich said, and the word carried the weight of a very long time. That is what I need. And you've been waiting for someone who came looking for the discrepancy rather than the legend. Someone who understood that the interesting part was what the official version got wrong. And why? Outside the keep, the wind had picked up. Sarah heard it moving through the gaps in the ruined walls, that particular minor chord of stone and wind that old places made when the night was moving. Her clay lamp burned on, steady and graceless and committed. I have a problem, she said. Tell me, the families. The ones descended from the 3 council members. 2 of them have representatives currently sitting on the Thornwall Society's board of directors. She watched his response, including the board member who approved my research credentials and signed my access pass for this region. The shadows around Aldrich Nail shifted, and she understood that this was not news to him. "You knew," she said. "I knew when you applied for your access pass," he said. "I have been watching the Society's research activities for 40 years. The board member in question has twice redirected historical research away from the pre-sundering period without formal justification. And you let me come here anyway. I let you find the journal," he said. Gorvin Pesh did not find it by accident. "I placed it where it would eventually reach someone with the right kind of attention. That took 60 years and 3 previous archivists who did not have it." A pause. "You have it." Sarah absorbed this. "So the person who approved my credentials to come here is potentially the person most motivated to prevent what I'm about to do." "Yes. And you've just told me everything." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment, and then she laughed, not with humor exactly, but with the sharp, slightly incredulous recognition of a situation that had become more complicated than she'd started the evening expecting. "You've been waiting in this ruin for 200 years, she said. "And you chose the person whose access credentials were signed by the opposition." "I chose the person who came looking for the discrepancy," Aldrich said. "And who?" When her lamp went out in the dark, lit a clay lamp instead and kept walking. Methodology matters. In the end, it is the only thing that consistently does. They worked through the rest of the night. Aldrich Neal's documentation was extraordinary. Not the word she would have reached for first. Extraordinary suggested the dramatic, the unusual, the kind of thing that announced itself. This was something quieter, years upon years of methodical shadow readings, organized with a rigor that made Sierra's professional admiration sit alongside her personal discomfort with the fact that she was sitting in a ruined keep at 4 in the morning reorganizing the historical record of an entire civilization with a 200-year-old shadow practitioner. He had anticipated the structural questions she would ask. He had cross-referenced his shadow readings against every surviving primary document from the pre-sundering period, those in the known archives, and the ones he had located over 2 centuries of systematic searching in the ruins of places that historians had written off as too deteriorated to yield useful material. The documentation had the quality of something built by someone who understood that they would not be present to defend it. Every claim was supported 3 ways. Every interpretation was marked clearly as interpretation rather than fact. Every gap was noted and its reason given. This is the work of someone who knew they were building for someone they hadn't met yet, Sierra said, toward what she estimated was the 3rd hour. Everything built to last is, Aldrich said. The practical problem, the board member, the compromised access path, the fact that she would need to return to Thornwall with documentation that certain powerful people had spent 2 centuries making sure did not exist, was not simple. Sarah laid it out systematically, the way she organized a difficult cataloging problem: assets, constraints, necessary outcomes, available pathways. Assets, the documentation itself, which was comprehensive enough to be academically unignorable if it reached the right venue. Her own established reputation, 4 years of credentialed work that made her difficult to dismiss as a fringe researcher. And Aldrich, who was not an asset in any way she had a word for, except that he was here and he knew things. And he had been playing a very long game with the specific patience of someone who had stopped being in a hurry approximately 2 centuries ago. Constraints, the board member. The network of interests that the falsified history had protected for so long that its protection had become, for some people, simply the background condition of their power. The fact that dramatic revelations without institutional infrastructure tended to produce more chaos than clarity, and chaos favored the people best positioned to survive it. "I'm not going to announce this," she said. "Not at first. Not as a revelation," Aldrich waited. "I'm going to publish it as scholarship. Careful, boring scholarship. The kind that takes 2 years to write and gets reviewed by 6 peers and sits in the bibliography of 11 subsequent papers. Before most people have read it. Paste. Referenced. Built so that by the time anyone with an interest in suppressing it understands what it is. It's already in 4 libraries in 3 cities and cited in the curriculum of the Ardeenmore Historical Institute. That is a slow approach, Aldrich said. It's the approach that works, she said. The dramatic revelation gets suppressed or discredited. The boring scholarship becomes the consensus position, and then the consensus position is impossible to suppress without suppressing the consensus. which requires admitting there is something worth suppressing. She looked at him. You've been patient for 200 years. I'm asking for 3 more. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. Not waiting, not measuring. Something more final, a door not closing but completing the arc it had always been on. 3 years, Aldrich said. I'll need copies of everything. Physical copies, not shadow held. And I'll need your testimony documented in a form that doesn't require your presence to be valid. Depositions, essentially. Signed, dated. Methodologically sound. I'm not certain a formal deposition from a 200-year-old shadow practitioner has clear legal standing. It doesn't need legal standing yet, Sarah said. It needs archival standing. That's different. I know how to establish that. They worked until the sky outside the keep's broken windows began to gray. Sarah writing and Aldrich speaking with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed this, in some version, for a very long time. Not performance. The precision of someone who had thought so hard about a thing for so long that the words for it had worn smooth. When the first real light came into the hall, pale and directionless, the kind of light that preceded dawn rather than constituting it, Sarah looked up from her writing and found that Aldrich Neal's form had become less distinct, not absent, but more returned to the shadow and stone of the hall, the way a very old presence sometimes settled back into the place it had spent, most of its time when the immediate need for presence was past. One question, she said. Yes, the legend. The Shadow Mage. The stories my grandmother told. She paused. How much of that was you and how much was accretion? People adding things over time? The quality of the silence this time was something she might, in different circumstances, have called amusement. The candle that would not stay lit, he said, is accurate. And the rest? The rest, he said, is what people need a story to be in order to hold it. The shape that makes it transmissible. A pause. I have read enough shadows to know that truth travels by means of the story it finds to inhabit. I did not choose the legend, but I understood its utility. Sarah looked around the inner hall in the growing pre-dawn light. The stone walls, the cracked flags, the history of a civilization still living in the shadows of the place where it had been decided. She thought about her grandmother's voice on winter evenings. She thought about Gorvin Pesh putting a journal in a box and marking it low priority. She thought about the specific, patient craft of building something for someone you hadn't met. She picked up her pack and her clay lamp, which had burned through the night without complaint, and she walked toward the entrance of the keep. At the threshold, she stopped. Will you still be here? She asked. In 3 years when I come back. The shadows of the hall moved. Very slightly in the way they had moved when she'd first asked him to show her what they remembered. That gathering. That settling, that quality of something ancient. And patient deciding to be present. I have been here for 280 years, Aldrich Neal said, from everywhere and nowhere in the room. I think I can manage 3 more. Sarah stepped out of the keep into the cold gray of almost dawn, and the light hit her face. And she walked back through the ruined outer walls and down the hillside track toward where her horse was tethered. And the legend of the Shadow Mage walked with her, not as a story she had been told, but as a thing she now understood from the inside, which was heavier and more useful and considerably more complicated than any story she had grown up with, and exactly as necessary. 3 years and 4 months later, a paper appeared in the Journal of the Aldenmore Historical Institute. Its title was not dramatic. Academic titles rarely were, and this one followed the convention scrupulously. Structural evidence for deliberate resonance. Failure in the final phase of the old compact. A re-examination of the pre-sundering governance record. The author was listed as Sarah Dunwald, Senior Archivist, Thornwall Historical Society, with an institutional affiliation that now included a visiting fellowship at the Ardeenmore Institute, that had been established specifically to house the research collection she had spent 3 years building. The paper was 72 pages long, including appendices. It was dense with citations. It had been peer-reviewed by 7 scholars in 3 cities, one of whom had immediately recognized the implications and tried, through a chain of institutional pressure that was itself somewhat illuminating, to delay publication. The delay had lasted 9 days before the editor of the journal, a small, precise woman named Magistra Fenwick, who had been in the field for 40 years and had a deep and practiced contempt for people who applied pressure to scholarship, rather than argument, had published it on schedule without comment. The paper did not announce a revelation. It presented evidence. Methodically, carefully, with every claim grounded and every interpretation labeled, building its case the way a good stone wall was built, course by course, each layer supporting the next, the structure earning its height. It took 3 months to be widely read. It took 6 more months for the responses to arrive in sufficient quantity to constitute a field-wide conversation. It took 8 months after that for the first formal historical commission to be convened by the Eldenmore Regional Governance Body to examine the documented claims. The board member at the Thornwall Historical Society who had signed Sarah's original access credentials resigned before the commission convened. No formal charges were filed. This was not, Sarah noted privately, the same as nothing happening. The two families most directly implicated by the documentation found, over the following years, that their historical foundation stories required significant revision. This was uncomfortable and complicated and in some respects ongoing. It was not the clean reckoning that dramatic stories tended to promise. It was the kind of reckoning that history actually provided, slow, partial, contested, and real. Sarah returned to Calden's Keep in the 4th year. She went alone in the early autumn when the Aldenmore foothills had the specific quality of light that belonged to that season. Warm, low, the kind that made everything look like it was being seen for the last time before winter changed it. She carried her clay lamp, because she was not sentimental about many things, but she was about this, and she walked through the outer walls and the inner hall and stood in the center of the flagstone floor. The shadows gathered. "It's in 5 libraries," she said. "Cited in 14 papers. The commission has confirmed the core findings. The official historical record has been formally amended in 2 of the 7 city-state successor territories, and the amendment is under review in a 3rd. The shadows held their quality of attention, that patient, present density, that she had spent 4 years thinking about and had still not found better words for. Not everything, she said. Not everything that should change has changed yet. But enough. Enough that it can't be unmade, she had asked herself many times in the previous 3 years. What she thought the legend of the Shadow Mage had actually been, what the story had contained, that made it survive 2 centuries of telling, what its function had been. She had answers now that she hadn't had in the keep on that first night. Sitting on the cold stone with a clay lamp and a practitioner who had been waiting longer than she'd been alive. The legend had been a container. A shape designed not to explain what Aldrich Nail was, but to hold the fact of him in the world's memory until the world was ready for the explanation. The frightening mage in the dark, the shadows that ate the light, it had kept people away and kept the work intact and kept the truth in a condition of preserved potential, the way seed stays viable in the right kind of dark, waiting for the right conditions to become something. She had been the conditions, or the beginning of them. "Thank you," she said, to the shadows in the hall and the 283-year-old. Patience that had built this moment out of documented readings and careful waiting and a journal placed at the bottom of a low-priority crate. The shadows moved, very gently, in the way she had come to understand was acknowledgement. She walked out of Calden's Keep into the autumn light and did not look back, because she did not need to, because some things once completed did not require looking back. They required carrying forward, which was different, and which was already happening in 14 citations and 2 amended records and an ongoing commission and a field-wide conversation that would not end cleanly or quickly or completely but would continue, which was all that truth ever really asked of anyone. The legend of the Shadow Mage had always been about a candle that would not stay lit. What it had never said, what it had been waiting for someone to discover, was that the reason the shadows ate the light was not hunger, it was preservation. Some things had needed the dark to survive long enough to reach the light. O destino desta historia, esta nas suas mas. Se voca acredita que o heroi não esta sozinho. Dic su like. Se voca vaio o que os outros não viram. Escreva sua teoria nas comentários. E se voca precisa saber o que acontece a seguir, inscreva-se. O próximo capítulo vai mudar tudo.